The rain had slowed to a mist, a gentle veil that softened the edges of the street and blurred the harsh lines of the city. The street lamp flickered one last time before settling into a steady glow, illuminating the German shepherd as he shifted his weight, pacing just outside the nursery window. I watched him from the doorway, umbrella forgotten, captivated by the quiet weight he carried in every movement. His eyes, still fixed on the baby's faint silhouette, held more than loyalty. They held a story I could feel in my chest, though I had yet to know its details. I remembered noticing the subtle scars first. Along his ears, behind his shoulders, faint lines etched into his fur like the faint map of a life endured. They were not recent. They had healed into pale reminders of pain long past, and yet they told of nights spent braving storms, avoiding dangers I could only guess at. His limp was almost imperceptible, but the careful way he shifted his weight, as if each step were calculated, spoke of an old injury that had never fully healed. This dog had survived things I could not name, and now somehow he had arrived at this small threshold, between the world outside and the fragile life inside. I found myself crouching closer to the window, tracing the faint paw prints he had left in the wet asphalt, each one a quiet echo of a journey that had brought him here. He had been somewhere else, somewhere he had lost and survived, and though I could not see the road behind him, I could feel it in the tension of his shoulders, the low set of his ears, the haunted glimmer in his gaze. He was a wanderer, yes, but not aimlessly. Every movement carried purpose, every glance held memory. I thought back to a rumor from a neighbor, half-whispered, that a dog like him had been seen near the outskirts of town weeks ago, alone, wandering along the old highway where the trees grew thick and the asphalt cracked under the frost. They had said he had appeared and disappeared like a shadow, always on the edge of something, never fully entering the lives of those he passed. It was easy to imagine why. Not every soul is meant for easy companionship. Not every life is meant for comfort. Not every creature can be tamed by kindness alone. He had carried something heavy, something that had made him wary of humans yet deeply aware of their fragility. And then there were the nights I had seen him before this, standing under the overpass near the river, silhouette sharp against the floodlights that hummed faintly in the fog. A man had tried to approach him once, calling softly, offering scraps of food. The dog had tilted his head, ears pricked, then backed away just enough to remain untouchable, always watching, always calculating. There was intelligence there, yes, but also caution, a wisdom born of survival, and perhaps of loss. Loss that I could sense in the curve of his spine, the tilt of his nose toward the ground, the careful way he avoided corners yet never abandoned them completely. He was a sentinel before he became mine to watch. I found myself walking along the wet pavement, careful not to disturb him, studying the way the mist clung to his fur, the subtle twitch of a muscle as he reacted to the baby's whimpers. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, without knowing it. He had known hardship, yes, but he had also known instinct. And instinct in creatures like him is a language older than words, sharper than fear, and softer than hope. He understood that the life inside that small nursery window was fragile, and he had chosen to protect it, not for reward, not for recognition, but because it was what he was meant to do. I remembered the collar he wore, a simple band of faded leather that had once borne a name. The tag was gone, the metal dull and scratched, but the leather still carried the faint scent of something familiar, soap, perhaps, or a lingering trace of a human hand that had once cared. The collar was a remnant, a silent hint at a past that had not been gentle, yet not entirely cruel. And I wondered quietly about the people who had loved him, the hands that had stroked his fur, the voices that had called his name, and the absence that had driven him into this rain-soaked vigil. His paws pressed into a puddle, sending ripples outward, each one distorting the reflection of the street lamp above. I noticed how he paused after every step, nose lowering toward the ground as if reading the story of the night etched in the wet earth. It was a story of survival, of hunger, of narrow escapes, of streets walked alone and dangers narrowly avoided. Every line of his body told it, though no word could capture the depth of experience in his eyes. And yet, despite everything, there was a gentleness there, too, a quiet, enduring tenderness that emerged whenever the baby shifted, whenever her tiny hand brushed the glass. His ears twitched, his tail barely moved, but his posture softened just enough to suggest that he understood her vulnerability. The contrast between his wariness and his care was striking, a testament to a creature capable of fierce protection, yet tempered with empathy. He had known suffering, and he refused to let it shadow her. I crouched lower, allowing the mist to curl around my coat, listening to the soft slosh of his paws in the shallow puddles. I wondered, not for the first time, how a dog so wary could have learned such patience. Perhaps it was a lesson forced upon him by years of solitude and survival, or perhaps it was a natural instinct that only the rarest of creatures possess the ability to recognize when life, no matter how small or fleeting, is sacred. And then in the distance I thought I heard a faint whistle of wind, or perhaps it was a memory stirring. I could almost imagine the streets he had traversed, the empty lots where he had slept, the abandoned houses where shadows had become his companions. He had been through storms, literal and figurative, yet here he was, standing sentinel in the drizzle outside a nursery, guarding a child he had never met. I realized then that I had begun to assign him motives that might not have existed. Perhaps he was simply drawn to the warmth of the light, the soft cry of a new life, the scent of innocence that his instinct could not ignore. Yet even as I questioned it, I knew that his presence was purposeful, and that purpose had led him here to this night, to this fragile connection between life and survival, between protection and trust. The mist lifted slightly as the street lamp hummed steadily, illuminating the subtle lines of his face, the damp curl of fur along his spine, the faint shadows under his eyes. He was more than a survivor now. He was a guardian. And I, standing quietly in the doorway, realized that in witnessing him, I had begun to understand something fundamental about resilience, about loyalty, about the quiet power of choosing to stay, no matter the hardship endured before. I stepped back, letting the door frame separate us, yet I could feel his gaze following me, attuned to my presence as much as to the baby's. In that moment, the first faint threads of connection began to weave themselves into a tapestry that neither of us could yet name, but which would come to define the nights and days to follow. He had been somewhere else before this. Somewhere hard, somewhere cold, somewhere unkind, and now somehow he had found a place at the edge of the nursery window, on the threshold of a life he was determined to protect. The mist had thinned, leaving the street slick and reflective under the steady glow of the street lamp. The German shepherd remained at his post, body tense but still eyes never leaving the nursery window. There was a patience in him that defied the storm, a quiet endurance born from nights spent alone on streets that offered nothing but uncertainty and danger. I could see it in the curve of his shoulders, the subtle twitch of a muscle as he reacted to each faint sound, the distant car, the drip of water from the eaves, the rustle of wind through the trees. Every small motion was deliberate, measured, a testament to a life that had demanded vigilance at all hours. I remember the first time I had glimpsed the depths of his past, not fully, not in detail, but in fragments that revealed themselves in the way he carried himself. It was in the hollow of his gaze when he paused by a puddle, tracing its edges with a paw, as if remembering another place entirely. The place was gone, but it lingered in him, invisible yet undeniable. A memory of warmth, of hands that had once offered comfort and then absence. I imagined the child or children he might have known, the laughter that once accompanied him, and the sudden void that had left him wandering. Loss had etched itself into his body and spirit, shaping every step he now took. He had not always been alone. I saw it in the scar that marked the bridge of his nose, faint but precise, a reminder of confrontation, a moment when trust had been broken or tested. I could feel the echoes of that encounter in his stance, the careful balance between wariness and courage. He had learned through necessity that survival demanded both strength and restraint. And yet there was another side, a gentleness buried beneath the scars and vigilance, a capacity for care that had not been dulled by the hardships of his past. The collar, worn and faded, offered another clue. Once I imagined it had borne a name. The human had claimed him even for a short while, and in that time he had known affection, protection, and the invisible tether that binds a dog to its family. Something had torn him from that life, whether through accident, neglect, or circumstance, and left him adrift. Yet even in his displacement, he carried the memory of care, of human touch that was tender and fleeting, a beacon he could not forget. I thought of the nights he must have endured, huddled under bridges or in the skeletal remains of abandoned buildings, rain and wind pounding, hunger gnawing at his stomach. I imagined him curled into himself, trying to preserve warmth in a body that had known only exposure, every night a negotiation with fear and fatigue. And still he had survived, honing a patience that now manifested as the steady vigil outside the nursery. He had learned the art of quiet endurance, of waiting, of guarding without expectation, and it had brought him here to this precise moment, drawn by instincts he had never forgotten. It was in the small gestures that his story revealed itself further. He sniffed along the edges of the street, nostrils flaring, tracing scents that spoke of other animals, other humans, of past meals and fleeting kindnesses. There was a rhythm to it, a silent cataloguing of the world that told me he was always listening, always learning. And yet the moment the baby stirred even slightly, his focus shifted completely. Nothing else existed beyond her fragile presence. He had known vulnerability in his own life, had known nights when no one watched, no one cared, and now he would not let it touch her. I crouched lower, letting the mist curl around me, feeling a chill that was both physical and emotional. In that cold, damp night, I understood something profound. His loyalty was not born of command, not of training or discipline, but of recognition. He recognized what was precious and fragile, and he had chosen to be its guardian. It was not a choice made lightly, not a role assumed easily. He had lived long enough to know that the world often failed the innocent, and he had resolved silently and with fierce determination to be the exception. I remembered glimpses of him in the days before this night, when he had appeared near the edges of our neighborhood, a shadow moving along empty streets, eyes reflecting street lamps, body tense but controlled. He had observed, measured, and calculated. There was intelligence in him that suggested he understood danger, yes, but also the value of patience, the power of waiting, the strength in restraint. He had been forming a plan without thought, instinct guiding him toward the place where he was most needed. And that place now was here just outside the nursery window, in the mist and rain, silently watching, silently protecting. The thought of the life he had lived before this one filled me with a mixture of awe and sorrow. He had been through storms far worse than the one falling now, faced hunger, isolation, and uncertainty that no dog should endure. Yet, despite it all, he had emerged capable of tenderness. It was the paradox that made him remarkable. A creature forged in adversity, carrying the scars of the past, yet still able to offer care and protection without hesitation. In his eyes I could see both the memory of suffering and the possibility of hope. The mist lifted slightly as I leaned against the doorframe, watching him. I could feel the weight of history in his posture, in the way he shifted his paws, in the subtle flare of his nostrils as he caught a new scent. Every scar, every limp, every faded memory was encoded in him, and yet it did not define him. It had shaped him, yes, but it had also prepared him for this night, for the quiet act of guardianship he now performed. He was not waiting for a reward. He was not waiting for acknowledgement. He was waiting for something far more fundamental, the opportunity to protect, to serve, to be present where he was needed most. I thought about the family he might have had, the humans who had once loved him, the voices that had called his name, the hands that had patted his fur. And then I thought of the absence that had followed, the loneliness that had driven him into streets and nights like this. But tonight I realized he had found a new purpose. He had found a child who needed him as much as he needed a reason to endure. And in that realization, a quiet warmth began to stir in my chest, fragile yet undeniable, like the first light of dawn through a storm-tossed window. He pressed his nose again to the glass, sensing her tiny hand beneath the thin blanket. And for a brief moment, I could see the history of his life in that simple act. The survival, the caution, the longing for connection, the refusal to abandon. The story was not fully revealed, not yet, but its essence was clear. He had endured loss, and he had endured it with dignity. Now he would endure vigil. Now he would stand between innocence and harm, between vulnerability and neglect. And for the first time in many nights, I allowed myself to believe that the world could be a little less harsh, that protection could be silent, unwavering, and profoundly healing. The night had grown quieter, the rain now a whisper against the rooftops and the glass of the nursery window. Mist lingered low along the street, curling around the German shepherd's legs, softening the edges of the wet asphalt. He had remained there for hours, silent and vigilant, eyes fixed on the pale glow of the nursery light. Each time the baby shifted in her crib, her tiny fingers brushing the thin blanket, he would tilt his head, nostrils flaring faintly, as if reading her presence with a language older than words. I watched from the doorway, my coat soaked and my thoughts heavy. Something about him unsettled me, and yet comforted me in equal measure. He carried the weight of a life I could only imagine, a history of loss, survival, and quiet endurance. And now, by some instinct I could not name, he had placed himself at the edge of this child's world, bridging the gap between danger and safety with nothing but his presence. The baby shifted again, her soft whimpers stirring the air. The dog's ears flicked forward, attentive, but he did not move closer immediately. He had learned patience, I realized, not just from survival, but from the understanding that some connections cannot be forced. They must be earned, revealed slowly like the faint unfolding of a flower in dawn's first light. His gaze never left her, steady and unwavering, a silent promise that he would remain no matter how long it took. I knelt closer to the window, noticing the details that marked him as a creature shaped by hardship. His fur was damp and matted, but not unkempt. There was a dignity to the way he carried himself, even after nights spent alone in the cold. The scars along his flank and ears were pale now, but they spoke of battles fought and endured, lessons learned and remembered. Even the faint limp in his paw suggested endurance, resilience, and an unwillingness to surrender. He had been tempered by life's difficulties, and now that strength served a higher purpose. I could see the baby's tiny chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket, her fingers curling slightly as she reached toward the glass again. The dog shifted slightly, pressing his nose against the window, just close enough to sense her warmth. The faint rhythm of her breath, the scent of her skin mingled with the clean softness of her blanket. In that moment, I understood that the connection was formed not through words, not through recognition of past or future, but through presence, through awareness, through an instinctual understanding that each had something to offer the other, protection, comfort, and silent companionship. He lowered his head closer to the glass, eyes softening, and I noticed a subtle change in his posture. The tension in his shoulders eased, though not entirely, and his tail flicked slightly, a signal that he recognized her vulnerability and accepted it as his charge. He had known suffering, and perhaps in her quiet fragility, he had found a reason to endure it anew. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and thoughtful. Nothing about him was impulsive, nothing hasty. He had learned to wait, and in that waiting he demonstrated the noblest kind of loyalty. I stepped slightly closer, careful not to startle him, and felt the weight of history pressing in around us. He had been somewhere else before this, somewhere that had tested him beyond measure, yet here he remained, steadfast. The streets he had traversed, the cold nights endured, the hunger and solitude, all of it had led him to this threshold, to this child, and to this quiet, misted night. I realized then that his journey had not been aimless. It had been purposeful, guided by instincts older and wiser than any map or path could dictate. The nursery was bathed in a gentle amber light, shadows playing across the walls as the mobile above the crib spun lazily. The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, gazing at the soft glow, then toward the window. Her tiny fingers reached for the glass once more, and the dog pressed his nose closer, barely daring to make contact, yet there was an unmistakable reverence in his posture. He understood her fragility, and acknowledged it without hesitation, a quiet acceptance that neither demanded recognition nor sought reward. It was the purest form of devotion I had ever witnessed. I thought about the nights he must have spent wandering before this, the hours curled beneath bridges or in abandoned lots, seeking safety where none existed. The rain had not been his only trial. Hunger, fear, and isolation had shaped him into the creature I now saw before me. Patient, watchful, capable of immense tenderness. And yet, despite all he had endured, he had retained an instinctive sense of right and wrong, a capacity for care that was undiminished by his hardships. He had been tempered, yes, but not broken. I knelt lower, letting the mist curl around me, and for a moment the three of us existed in a fragile equilibrium. The baby, the dog, and I, each aware of the other, without words. He had found his place beside her, not as a playmate, not yet, but as a sentinel. and she, in her small, unknowing way, had recognized him as a presence that could be trusted. Trust in its earliest form, tentative and delicate, had begun to grow. The air carried the faint scent of wet fur and baby powder, a combination that was grounding and comforting. I noticed the way he shifted his weight slightly, careful to maintain balance on the slick pavement, the muscles in his shoulders and back rippling under the damp coat. Each movement was precise, measured, and full of intent. Nothing about him was careless. Everything about him spoke of experience, endurance, and a quiet but profound devotion. The baby's whimpering softened, replaced by a low, almost curious coo. The German shepherd's ears flicked forward, tail still gently moving, and he pressed his head closer to the glass, acknowledging the subtle shift in her state. In that moment, a fragile bond was forged, not through speech or command, but through presence and recognition. He had survived much, yes, but here, at the edge of this nursery window, he began to understand the meaning of guardianship in its purest form. I found myself drawn to the small symbols of connection, the blanket tucked around her tiny body, the paw prints in the wet street, the gentle mist curling between us. They were reminders that life, despite its hardships, could still offer moments of tenderness and trust. The dog had survived storms, both literal and metaphorical, and now, for the first time in a long while, I felt the possibility of something new taking root: protection, companionship, and the quiet, unspoken understanding between two beings who had both known loss. The night deepened, yet neither the dog nor the baby wavered. He remained at his post, vigilant and patient, his eyes never leaving the faint outline of her small body. And she, in turn, began to settle slightly, comforted by the presence of a creature she had not yet named, but whose intent she could feel. It was a delicate equilibrium, a moment suspended in mist and amber light, where trust was born, and the first threads of connection began to weave themselves into a tapestry that would define the nights and days to follow. The night had grown stiller, the mist fading into a faint haze that softened the outlines of the buildings and made the wet pavement shimmer under the pale glow of the street lamp. The German shepherd remained at his post, body alert but calm, eyes never leaving the nursery window. The baby shifted slightly in her crib, a soft whimper escaping her lips, and he responded with the gentlest tilt of his head, nostrils flaring faintly as he read the delicate rhythm of her breath. I leaned against the doorway, coat damp, umbrella long forgotten, heart heavy with a mix of awe and concern. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, a patience forged from countless nights of survival, and I realized I had been holding my breath, afraid to disturb the fragile connection forming before me. He had survived storms, hunger, and solitude, yet here he remained, drawn to the smallest pulse of life inside that softly lit room. The baby's hand twitched, brushing against the soft blanket as though searching for something unseen. The German shepherd shifted slightly, lowering his head closer to the glass, eyes softening in recognition. It was not curiosity that drove him. It was awareness, instinct honed by hardship, an unspoken understanding that this small being required protection and that he had the capacity to provide it. I crouched closer, watching the subtle exchange, marveling at the quiet eloquence of their interaction. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The language they shared was older than speech, a shared awareness of vulnerability and care, a silent acknowledgement that each had something to offer the other. He had known loss, fear, and betrayal, and yet in her tiny movements, in the faint scent of her skin and blanket, he found a reason to endure, to watch, to protect. The nursery light flickered briefly, casting long shadows across the walls. The baby's eyes fluttered open, gazing toward the window, and the dog's ears pricked forward. He shifted his weight slightly, careful not to startle her, and pressed his nose closer to the glass. I could almost feel the warmth of recognition passing between them, subtle yet profound, an understanding forged in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. It occurred to me then how much history he carried, how many nights had shaped the careful deliberation in every motion. Scars along his ears and shoulders spoke of past confrontations. His faint limp told of an injury that had never fully healed, yet none of it had hardened him completely. In fact, it seemed to have taught him empathy, patience, and restraint. He had survived hardship, yes, but he had emerged capable of tenderness, able to recognize the fragile and the innocent, and respond not with fear or aggression, but with protection. The baby's soft coos were almost inaudible above the drizzle that continued to lace the night, yet they were enough to draw the dog's attention fully. He lowered his head further, nose nearly touching the glass, and I noticed the subtle exhale he made, a breath of quiet acceptance. He had chosen to stay, not because he had to, but because he understood the gravity of the moment, the unspoken duty that had brought him here. I thought of the nights he must have endured before this, wandering streets long after dark, seeking shelter in abandoned lots and beneath skeletal structures, enduring cold and hunger, and yet never losing the capacity for awareness. Each step he had taken in those lonely hours had prepared him for this night, for this vigil outside a nursery where life was fragile and hope was tentative. And in that preparation, I could see the quiet shaping of a soul capable of both endurance and profound care. The mist curled around his legs as he shifted, the faint light of the street lamp catching the damp fur along his back. I noticed the collar again, faded and frayed, a remnant of a past life that had been brief, tender, and ultimately lost. There was a trace of human scent still clinging to it, faint but undeniable, and it spoke of someone who had once claimed him, even if only for a fleeting moment. The memory of that bond, however brief, had not left him. It lingered, subtle yet persistent, shaping the way he now approached life, shaping the care with which he watched over the child. Inside the nursery, the baby's tiny hand stretched again toward the window, fingers brushing against the glass, seeking warmth, presence, connection. The dog responded with a subtle shift of his weight, moving just close enough to mirror her reach, without breaking the fragile boundary. He had learned in ways I could not fully comprehend the delicate balance between vigilance and gentleness. Every muscle, every movement was deliberate, every glance a silent promise: I am here. You are safe. I stepped back, allowing the doorway to frame the tableau, realizing that this silent exchange carried more weight than any words could convey. He had endured nights of fear and abandonment, of hunger and exposure, and yet he had retained the ability to care, to protect, to recognize the fragile threads of life and guard them as fiercely as he could. The baby, in her innocence, had awakened that instinct, and in doing so had forged a bond that transcended the ordinary. The air smelled faintly of wet fur, rain-soaked asphalt, and the delicate powder of a child's presence. The German shepherd's eyes glimmered in the dim light, reflecting both the glow of the nursery and the weight of his own memories. He had been tested, shaped and scarred by life, yet here he remained steadfast and patient. And I, standing quietly in the doorway, felt a quiet stirring of something I had not felt in years: hope. Hope is born not of circumstance, but of witness, of observation, of the knowledge that sometimes survival leads to guardianship, that endurance can lead to connection, that loyalty can find its place in even the smallest of hearts. The baby shifted once more, a soft sigh escaping her lips, and the dog's ears flicked forward, tail moving subtly, a whisper of motion that mirrored her tentative comfort. In that moment, time itself seemed suspended. The rain, the mist, the dim glow of light, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the careful, measured breathing of the dog outside. There was a fragile equilibrium, delicate and transient, yet imbued with a quiet power. The power of presence, the power of witnessing, the power of trust beginning to take root. I crouched lower, watching the exchange, marveling at the subtle eloquence of their communication. There were no words, yet everything was said. The dog had learned patience, endurance, and empathy from nights of solitude and hardship, and now he applied them with precision, guided by instinct and a deep recognition of vulnerability. The baby, sensing his careful attention, relaxed slightly, her tiny body softening under the blanket, her fingers curling in response to a presence that was both silent and protective. As the night deepened, the mist lifted just enough to reveal the faint outline of the dog's body, steady and unwavering, shadowed yet luminous in the soft glow of the street lamp. I realized then that this quiet vigil, this unspoken guardianship, was not simply an act of survival, it was an act of choice. He had chosen to remain, to protect, to care, to witness life in its most vulnerable form, and in doing so, he had begun to write a new chapter for himself, for her, and for the fragile threads that bound us together. The gentle drip of water from the eaves marked the passage of time, Yet neither dog nor child moved from their positions of quiet attention. The bond, tentative and delicate, had begun to solidify in these small gestures: the tilt of a head, the soft press of a nose, the reach of tiny fingers, the subtle exhalation of relief. And in that silent communion, I understood something profound. Sometimes love and trust are not proclaimed, they are shown. Slowly, carefully. With patience born of endurance and hardship, they are built brick by silent brick until they form a foundation strong enough to withstand the storms that life may yet bring. The following morning arrived with a muted grey light, clouds heavy with the remnants of the night's rain. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic, the residue of a storm that had left the streets glistening and slick. I stepped cautiously to the window, hesitant to disturb what had become a quiet vigil. The German shepherd had remained in place through the night, his coat drying unevenly, fur clinging in damp strands along his spine. Yet he was alert, every muscle tuned, eyes sharp yet calm, as if aware that his duty did not end with the dark. The baby stirred in her crib, a faint gurgle escaping her lips. Her small hands pressed against the soft blanket, fingers curling and uncurling, searching, reaching. The dog's ears pricked, his head tilted slightly, a subtle shift forward as though he were drawing a line between her fragile movements and the uncertain world outside. The night had passed, but the bond that had begun in mist and rain now lingered, strengthened by hours of silent attention. I found myself moving closer to the window, breath fogging the glass as I watched him. There was something almost sacred in the way he observed her, a reverence that transcended mere curiosity or instinct. He had known hardship, yes, countless nights of hunger and exposure, the sharp edges of loneliness, the sting of loss, yet none of it had hardened him in ways that would prevent care. In fact, it seemed that every experience had honed him for this precise purpose: to be present, to be steadfast, to act as an unspoken guardian for the vulnerable. His movements were careful, measured, and deliberate. Each step he took along the wet pavement was precise, avoiding puddles and debris as though the very ground were an extension of his responsibility. He paused, sniffed, and then lowered his head to observe the baby's subtle shifts. I noticed a soft exhale, a subtle, almost imperceptible breath, as though he recognized her innocence, and felt a quiet relief that she remained safe in her crib. It was a tenderness born not of obligation, but of understanding, of recognition, of a purpose he had embraced fully, silently. I thought about the nights he must have endured before this, the empty streets, the cold concrete beneath him, the hunger gnawing at his ribs, the faint fear of unseen dangers. Every scar, every matted patch of fur, every subtle limp in his stride told a story of survival. And yet, despite all of that, here he remained, patient, observant, and gentle in ways that contrasted sharply with the harshness of his past. I realized then that he was undergoing a transformation, one that I could witness but could not yet fully comprehend. From survivor to protector, from observer to active guardian. The baby's hand reached again, brushing against the blanket in small tentative movements. The dog responded almost immediately, lowering his nose to the glass, tail flicking faintly, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence. The rhythm of their interaction was quiet, almost imperceptible but profound. Every gesture was laden with meaning, her trust, his vigilance, the silent communication that had formed between them through hours of observation and patience. I stepped back, allowing the morning light to illuminate the tableau, and I could see in detail the scarred ears, the faint limp, the wet and matted fur beginning to dry along his spine. Every mark, every subtle injury, spoke of a life endured with dignity, and yet despite the history etched into him, there was a softness in his eyes, a capacity for care that had survived all else. He had known fear, isolation, and hunger, but he had not forgotten tenderness, not in the slightest. By mid-morning, the dog began to move more deliberately. He shifted closer to the nursery window, paws pressing lightly against the damp pavement as he adjusted his angle to observe her more clearly. There was a fluidity to his movements now, a sense that he was learning, adapting, and responding not just to instinct, but to the subtle cues of her presence. He was no longer simply waiting. He was acting in small, careful ways to ensure her safety. I noticed the first hints of playful curiosity in the baby. Her fingers reached toward the window repeatedly, and she cooed softly, her voice carrying a melody that seemed to resonate with him. The German shepherd's ears flicked, tail moving slightly in response, and he lowered his head even further, almost inviting her to engage without crossing the fragile boundary between them. It was an exchange of energy, trust, and recognition, silent yet deeply expressive. The transformation became more evident as the morning wore on. The dog began to follow subtle cues beyond the crib, reacting to sounds and movements throughout the room. A small rattle on the dresser caused him to lift his head, ears forward, eyes alert. The baby's soft gasp in response to the sound was mirrored by the tilt of his head, the careful repositioning of his body, a silent reassurance that she was safe. He was learning the rhythms of her environment, anticipating potential disruptions, and adjusting his vigilance accordingly. I watched him fascinated as the hours passed. The rain had ceased, leaving puddles that reflected the pale sky, and yet he remained rooted in his purpose. There was a sense of deliberation in every movement, a careful calibration between watchfulness and gentleness. He had transformed from a dog defined by survival to one defined by guardianship. He was present, aware, attuned, and entirely committed to the fragile life inside the nursery window. At one point, the baby shifted and rolled slightly in her crib. The German shepherd responded instantly, stepping closer to the window, body low, eyes alert. His gaze followed every subtle movement, every flutter of her tiny hands, every sigh or coo. I realized then that he had internalized a new rhythm, one dictated not by fear or caution but by care and responsibility. He had become attuned to her, learning to anticipate her needs, to react without being intrusive, to maintain a presence that was protective without being overwhelming. By afternoon, the pattern was unmistakable. The dog moved in harmony with the baby's quiet signals, a dance of presence and observation. Each subtle shift, each tentative gesture from her was mirrored by an adjustment from him, and I, standing quietly in the doorway, could see the profound depth of what was unfolding, a bond forming, not through words, not through command, but through the silent, patient act of mutual recognition. He had become her sentinel, and she in turn had begun to recognize the reliability of his vigilance. The sun broke through the clouds briefly, casting a pale light across the wet streets. The dog's coat glistened, catching the light, and his eyes reflected both history and purpose. I realized then that he had fully embraced his role. He was no longer a survivor, merely existing at the edge of the world. He was an active guardian, present, attentive, and profoundly committed to the safety of a life far smaller and more fragile than his own. The transformation was complete in essence, though the journey to full trust and companionship was only beginning. And as the baby drifted into a quiet nap, the German shepherd remained steadfast and still, a silent presence that spoke volumes. He had undergone a quiet metamorphosis, from observer to protector, from survivor to caretaker, and in doing so, he had begun to teach all of us, me, the baby. Anyone watching that vigilance tempered by empathy can create bonds stronger than any spoken word, and that endurance and patience can lead to connection, trust in something far more profound than survival alone. By mid-morning, the nursery had settled into a gentle rhythm, one marked by soft sunlight filtering through thin curtains, the faint hum of the heater, and the baby's quiet breathing. I had moved from doorway to hallway, careful to maintain a respectful distance, observing the German shepherd as he continued his vigil outside the window. He had shifted slightly from the night's post, now pacing just enough to adjust to the light, to the sounds of distant traffic, and to the subtle changes in the environment. Every movement remained deliberate, precise, and utterly focused on the fragile life within the nursery walls. I leaned against the wall, breathing shallow, struck by the quiet intensity of his presence. This was no ordinary dog. He was not a creature content to merely exist or to seek human approval. He was aware, attuned, and profoundly patient. And yet he was beginning to reveal something else, a subtle engagement with the world around him that suggested recognition, not just of survival, but of purpose. He had learned, through hardship and solitude, to translate vigilance into something meaningful: guardianship, empathy, and quiet devotion. The baby stirred again, tiny hands brushing the soft blanket, cooing softly. At that sound, the dog shifted his stance, lowered his head closer to the glass, and pressed his nose gently against the pane. The faint warmth of her breath fogged the window, and he paused, seemingly inhaling her presence, absorbing it with a reverence that took my breath away. There was a subtle exhale, almost imperceptible, that suggested relief, as though he recognized her comfort and found satisfaction in ensuring it remained uninterrupted. I moved slowly down the hallway, careful not to startle him, and found myself studying him in greater detail. The scars along his shoulders, the faint limp in his paw, the worn collar that hinted at a past life, each detail spoke of resilience, endurance, and survival. And yet here he was, transformed by circumstance into a sentinel, whose purpose was not self-preservation, but protection of another, smaller, more fragile life. It was a quiet miracle, the kind that manifests in patient observation and subtle gestures, rather than dramatic proclamation. I could see the faint trace of intelligence in his eyes, a depth that suggested reflection, experience, and an understanding of human fragility. He had been shaped by nights of hunger, fear, and isolation, yet he now applied that knowledge with meticulous care. He anticipated the baby's movements, responded to her minor shifts in posture, and adjusted his stance to provide reassurance without intrusion. There was a rhythm developing, a silent language between child and guardian, one that relied on observation, presence, and trust rather than words. I moved closer to the window, careful to maintain the delicate equilibrium, and I realized something profound. His actions were teaching me as much as they were protecting the baby. I had been witnessing the emergence of empathy, patience, and devotion in its purest, quietest form. He had endured hardships that no child should ever know, yet he had retained the capacity for care, tenderness, and vigilance. And now those qualities were manifesting in an almost sacred ritual of guardianship. The baby's gaze met him across the thin barrier of glass, and for a brief moment, time seemed suspended. Her tiny fingers reached again, brushing the blanket, her coos growing slightly more animated. The dog's ears flicked, tail moving subtly, and his head lowered further as though to mirror her vulnerability with an equal measure of presence. There was no urgency in him, no rush, only the quiet acknowledgement that her well-being was now his responsibility. It was at this moment that the subtle miracle of trust began to manifest fully. I watched as the dog shifted slightly to accommodate the baby's movements, the faintest exhalation escaping him as he adjusted, repositioned, and observed. His eyes never left her, but there was a softness now, a gentle patience and acceptance of her presence that spoke of both history and hope. He had endured nights of solitude, hunger, and danger, yet here he was, capable of connection, empathy, and protective vigilance without hesitation. I could not help but marvel at the depth of this silent exchange. There were no words, no commands, no overt signals, just the subtle rhythm of mutual recognition, the quiet emergence of trust, and the delicate unfolding of a bond forged through observation, patience, and presence. He was not merely watching, he was participating, guiding, and safeguarding, and in doing so, he was demonstrating a form of loyalty and devotion that few humans ever truly comprehend. The morning wore on, and I noticed changes in the dog's demeanor. He began pacing slightly farther along the window line, adjusting to the sun's movement and the faint sounds from the street beyond. Yet he remained steadfast, ever vigilant, his body language conveying assurance and protection rather than dominance or fear. The baby responded to these subtle cues, her movements gentle, her coos soft, and her gaze unwavering. The bond was no longer tentative. It had begun to solidify into something tangible, a quiet understanding that each was attuned to the other's presence and needs. I thought back to his life before this moment, imagining the nights spent on cracked pavement, in alleys beneath abandoned structures. Hunger, fear, and isolation had been constant companions, and yet they had not eroded his capacity for tenderness. Instead, they had honed it, refined it, and prepared him for this night, for this day, for this silent role as guardian to a life smaller, more fragile, and more innocent than his own. It was a testament to endurance, patience, and the unspoken wisdom that comes only from experience. As the afternoon light softened and shadows lengthened, I felt a quiet sense of awe settle over me. The dog remained outside the window, attentive and composed, yet the subtle cues of his behavior suggested a deeper understanding of his role. He was no longer merely a survivor. He was a protector, a presence capable of ensuring the baby's safety and comfort without intrusion, without expectation, without ceremony. He was teaching us all silently and gently the power of patience, the meaning of guardianship, and the quiet strength inherent in observation, empathy, and unwavering vigilance. I took a step back, allowing the tableau to remain uninterrupted. The baby's eyes closed briefly in a small, contented nap, and the dog settled slightly, head resting near the glass, body relaxed but poised. The scene was a portrait of quiet devotion, endurance, and the fragile emergence of trust. I understood in that moment that this bond formed in rain, mist, and quiet observation was only the beginning, but it carried the weight of history, experience, and the promise of a connection that could withstand time, hardship, and uncertainty. The sun dipped lower, casting the faintest golden light across the wet pavement, illuminating the dog's damp fur and highlighting the subtle lines of his face, the scars that marked him as a survivor. The worn collar that whispered of a past life, now transformed into something new. The baby stirred again, tiny hands reaching, and the German Shepherd responded with the same measured attentiveness, his eyes soft yet vigilant, his presence steady, unwavering, and deeply protective. In that quiet moment, I realized the truth of what had been unfolding. The dog's silent transformation was complete. From survivor to sentinel, from observer to guardian, he had embraced a purpose far greater than himself, and in doing so, he had begun to bridge the fragile gap between innocence and vigilance, between history and hope, and between a small, unknowing child and a creature whose past had prepared him for this very role. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, painting the nursery walls in soft amber and long shadows. Outside, the streets reflected the fading glow of day, slick with residual rain, the air thick with the faint scent of wet earth and the metallic tang of storm. The German Shepherd remained in his post, steadfast, his posture calm yet alert, every sense attuned to the fragile life within the nursery. The baby, now drowsy from a day of quiet exploration, shifted in her crib, small hands brushing the blanket. Her movements were mirrored in the dog's subtle adjustments, ears flicking, body weight shifting, tail gently brushing the pavement. I stepped closer to the window, the fog of my breath mingling with the slight condensation along the glass, and watched him. There was a calm precision in his presence, but I noticed something new, a subtle tension, a sharpening of awareness that suggested he had detected something I could not. Perhaps it was the faint rustle of leaves along the alley, the distant bark of another dog, or the muffled sounds of human activity beyond the block. Whatever it was, it had drawn his attention, not in fear but in calculation. He had learned to anticipate danger, to assess threats, and to act with measured response, and now I could see that instinct was preparing him for something beyond the quiet vigilance he had maintained so far. The baby's small fingers reached for the edge of her blanket, tugging it slightly, and he responded with a subtle tilt of his head, nose pressing closer to the glass, as if to reassure her that he remained present, that she was safe. His movements were deliberate, slow, and filled with intention. There was no panic in him, no flaring of aggression, only readiness, the quiet promise that whatever disturbance approached, he would meet it without hesitation, guided by the patience and empathy he had cultivated through years of survival. I thought of the nights he must have endured before finding her, nights of hunger, exposure, and solitude. Every scar, every limp, every worn patch of fur had been a testament to endurance. And yet, despite it all, he had retained something rare, a capacity for careful observation, for protective devotion, and for the silent, patient application of intelligence. The transformation I had witnessed over the last day, survivor to sentinel, observer to guardian, was now entering a new phase. The first tests of his loyalty and vigilance were beginning, subtle yet unavoidable. The distant sound of footsteps reached the edges of the nursery window, faint at first, then closer. The German Shepherd's ears pricked sharply, head lifting, nostrils flaring as he traced the scent and sound with precision. His body shifted slightly, muscles tensing, tail lowering to the ground in readiness. It was not an overt threat, not yet, but a subtle reminder of the world beyond the protective circle he had formed around the baby. I felt my own breath catch in my chest, witnessing the transformation of instinct into action, calm, deliberate, and prepared. The baby let out a soft whimper as the footsteps grew nearer, small fingers clutching at the blanket. The dog responded immediately, pressing his nose against the glass with a reassuring weight, tail flicking slowly in rhythm with the small rise and fall of her chest. It was an unspoken communication. "I am here. You are safe." His vigilance was no longer passive. It had become active, anticipatory. He was engaging with the environment, not just as observer but as protector, calculating, preparing, and responding in ways that demonstrated a depth of understanding I could only marvel at. I moved slightly back from the window, giving him space to act without interference, and I noticed a subtle shift in the baby's posture. She sensed the tension in his body, the careful calculation of each muscle, and for a moment her small face reflected trust and recognition. She did not speak, could not articulate the understanding she felt, yet her body responded, relaxing slightly under the assurance of his silent guardianship. I realized then that this was no ordinary bond. It was the mutual recognition of responsibility, trust, and instinct, unfolding without words, without ceremony, in a space between vigilance and care. A shadow moved along the far side of the street, blurred by the fading light and mist. The German shepherd's gaze followed it with precision, body shifting subtly, muscles coiled in readiness. It was a small disturbance, a pedestrian perhaps, or an animal passing, but it was enough to demonstrate the depth of his vigilance. Every sensory input he processed became part of a larger awareness, a network of protection extending beyond the window and crib, embracing the baby with a presence that was both physical and spiritual. I thought again of his history, the nights alone, the cold concrete, the distant echoes of a world that offered little comfort. He had been forged by hardship, refined by endurance, and tempered by survival, and now that history served a higher purpose. He was no longer merely a survivor acting out instinct. He was an agent of protection, drawing on every lesson of his past to create a safe space for another being, fragile yet unbroken, small yet demanding of care and attention. The light shifted again as the sun descended, and I noticed the first subtle signs of fatigue in his posture. The muscles along his shoulders loosened fractionally, yet his eyes remained sharp, his awareness unbroken. He had endured much, yet his focus remained unwavering. The baby's small sighs of comfort were mirrored in his gentle press against the glass, a continuation of their ongoing dialogue of presence and reassurance. In that shared moment, I understood the enormity of what was unfolding. He had not only claimed a role, but had accepted it with a depth of commitment few could comprehend. The approaching footsteps, though faint, reminded me that the world outside this fragile sanctuary was still unpredictable, still potentially threatening. The dog's reaction was subtle but undeniable, a shift in stance, a soft growl low in his throat, barely audible, designed not to intimidate but to prepare. It was a demonstration of restraint as well as readiness, a careful balance of instinct, intelligence, and the desire to protect without creating unnecessary alarm. I watched him transfixed as the shadow passed and the footsteps receded. The tension in his body eased slightly, but his gaze never wavered from the window. He remained a sentinel, vigilant and patient, a presence that radiated both assurance and quiet power. The baby, sensing his continued attention, relaxed further, her tiny body melting into the softness of the crib. In that fragile equilibrium, I felt the weight of trust, loyalty, and the beginnings of a bond that would define both their lives in ways I could not yet fully predict. As dusk settled over the city, painting the nursery in soft golds and muted shadows, I understood something profound. The dog's transformation was now complete in practice. Vigilance had become active guardianship, patience had evolved into deliberate care, and instinct had merged with empathy to create a quiet, enduring presence. The subtle threats of the world, the shadows, the footsteps, the unpredictability of life outside the nursery had been met not with panic or fear, but with calm, intelligent protection. And in that protection, he had begun to weave the beginnings of a trust that would carry both him and the baby through the nights to come. The evening settled over the neighborhood with a muted hush, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence. Streetlights flickered on, their pale amber glow reflecting against puddles that mirrored the clouds above. The air carried the faint scent of wet asphalt and the subtle chill of approaching night. I remained near the nursery window, watching the German shepherd who had now become an unwavering presence at the threshold of the baby's world. His body was taut with vigilance, but not in the frantic way of fear. It was the disciplined readiness of a creature who understood his responsibility and had accepted it fully. But now something new crept into the edges of that fragile sanctuary, a pressure that belonged to the world beyond observation and instinct. It was the arrival of the neighbor, a man from the block leaning casually against the fence, casually glancing toward the nursery window. I had seen him before, the occasional nod exchanged across the street, a polite smile, the faint acknowledgement of routine human interactions. Yet tonight there was something different in his gaze, a subtle curiosity that bordered on scrutiny, an interest that felt intrusive, though not overtly threatening. The dog's ears flicked, nostrils flaring, tail lowering just slightly as he detected the presence long before I could fully process it. The baby stirred, her small hand brushing the blanket in unconscious rhythm, and the German shepherd responded instantly, pressing his nose closer to the glass as though to remind her that she remained safe. His stance was fluid yet controlled, every muscle coiled in readiness. The stranger remained for only a moment, but it was enough to test the dog's loyalty, vigilance, and the quiet trust that had been built over hours of careful observation. I realized then how delicate this balance had become. The dog had transformed into a sentinel, yet the world beyond the window remained unpredictable, filled with eyes that might not understand, might not respect, might even threaten the fragile connection between child and guardian. I stepped closer to the window, heart tightening, watching as he adjusted his position, tail brushing lightly against the wet pavement, eyes never leaving the small figure inside the nursery. The tension was subtle but palpable, a shift in energy that spoke volumes about his understanding of potential danger. He had survived so many nights alone, so many threats unseen and unspoken, and yet here he was, facing a new kind of test, one defined not by hunger or cold, but by human scrutiny, by choices beyond instinct and survival, choices that could determine the continuity of this fragile, budding bond. The neighbor lingered a few steps away, eyes scanning the street and then returning to the window. I could feel the dog's focus sharpen, body coiling with an almost imperceptible motion that suggested readiness to act if necessary. His instincts, honed over nights of exposure, recognized the nuances I might miss. A glance, a posture, a subtle movement that could herald risk. And yet, there was restraint in every motion, a deliberate choice not to escalate, not to challenge without cause. It was a testament to the depth of his guardianship, the disciplined application of awareness and care. The baby's small coos and soft sighs created a gentle rhythm against the tension of the street outside. Her tiny hands continued to brush the blanket, now with a quiet curiosity, sensing the slight disturbance in the environment, but trusting the invisible shield provided by the dog. I realized then that this silent communication had grown into something profound, an understanding that safety could be maintained without words, through presence alone, and that trust could extend beyond the nursery walls if met with steady vigilance. I thought about the choice that now lay before me. The German shepherd had claimed this role, had proven his loyalty, patience, and protective nature beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet the world outside, however small, now began to exert pressure and scrutiny that could easily have unintended consequences. I considered the risk of neighbors misunderstanding, authorities questioning, or others interfering in ways that might separate the child from her silent guardian. It was a quiet, heavy realization. Love and loyalty, even when perfect, were not always enough to protect against the intrusion of circumstance. I stepped back slightly, giving the dog room to breathe, and watched as he adjusted his stance once more. His gaze swept the nursery, the baby, and then outward toward the street, evaluating the balance between vigilance and reassurance. There was no hesitation in him, only clarity. He had endured isolation, hunger, fear, and uncertainty, yet nothing had prepared him for the subtleties of human oversight and decision-making. He was aware of the fragility of his position, yet he maintained it with unwavering precision, embodying patience, loyalty, and the quiet acceptance of responsibility. The neighbor finally moved on, footsteps retreating, but the air remained heavy with the implications of the encounter. I exhaled slowly, realizing that this was only the beginning of what might come. External pressures, human misunderstanding, and the delicate nature of trust could yet test the bond between the baby and her guardian. And yet, in the German shepherd's steady, measured presence, I found reassurance. He had chosen this role, embraced it fully and was capable of navigating threats both seen and unseen. The baby's eyes closed again, drifting into a soft nap. The dog remained at his post, head resting gently against the glass, muscles relaxed yet ready, tail flicking faintly in rhythm with her breathing. The tension of the earlier intrusion had passed, but its memory lingered in his posture, a quiet reminder that vigilance must never falter, that care must remain deliberate, and that trust is a fragile, precious thing, easily disrupted by forces outside our immediate control. I moved to a chair nearby, letting the scene unfold without interference, and I found myself reflecting on the depth of what had been created between them. This bond, forged in mist, rain, and quiet observation, had now faced its first test. The German Shepherd had responded not with panic or aggression, but with calm, measured guardianship. The baby, sensing his continued presence and unwavering attention, had remained calm, her trust reinforced by his silent guidance. It was a delicate equilibrium, yet one that demonstrated the resilience of connection, forged through patience, observation, and mutual recognition. The evening deepened into twilight, the soft amber of streetlights blending with the muted grey of clouds above. The streets outside were quieter now, yet I could feel the lingering weight of possibility, the knowledge that human curiosity, misunderstanding, or external threat could return at any moment. The dog remained vigilant, poised between repose and readiness, a living emblem of endurance and protection. The baby's soft breaths, tiny hands curled under her blanket, and the warm, protective presence of her guardian created a fragile sanctuary, one suspended in time and strengthened by quiet devotion. In that stillness, I realized the significance of choice, not just his but mine. To recognize, protect, and defend the bond we had begun to form was now more crucial than ever. The dog had demonstrated patience, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to a life smaller, more fragile, and entirely dependent on his vigilance. And I, as an observer, as someone who had come to witness and cherish this relationship, had to make decisions that would honor that bond, safeguard it from intrusion, and allow it to continue its delicate unfolding. As the last light faded from the nursery and the street beyond, I understood that we were entering a new phase. The bond between child and guardian had been tested, subtly but meaningfully, by the pressures of the outside world. And yet, in the German Shepherd's steady presence, I found a quiet certainty. He was prepared to endure, to protect, and to teach us all that loyalty and trust, when practiced with patience and empathy, can withstand even the uncertain scrutiny of the world. Night had fallen fully over the city, wrapping streets and rooftops in a quiet darkness, pierced only by the dim glow of streetlights. Rain had returned in soft, persistent drizzle, tapping a slow rhythm against the nursery window, where the German Shepherd remained stationed. His coat, now mostly dry, bore the faint sheen of moisture, a lingering reminder of the day's storms. The baby lay in her crib, eyes fluttering closed as soft, steady breaths rose and fell with the slow cadence of sleep. Outside, the world was indifferent, as it always had been, but inside that small room, a quiet drama of loyalty, courage, and decision had reached a pivotal moment. I had been pacing the hallway for hours, wrestling with a weight that pressed down in my chest. The earlier encounter with the neighbor, subtle yet probing, had awakened a tension that refused to dissipate. I knew the bond between the dog and the baby had grown deep in the span of a single day, a bond forged in rain, patience, and quiet observation. But the world beyond the nursery was still capable of intervention, of misjudgment, of decisions that could separate them forever. And now a choice had emerged, one that demanded courage, clarity, and the quiet assertion of what I knew to be right. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, resting his chin against the glass, eyes following the faint movements of the baby's hands beneath the blanket. Every motion was careful, measured, intentional, a reflection of the trust he had cultivated over hours of vigilance and attention. I stepped closer, hesitating, feeling the enormity of the moment. He had survived so much, endured nights of hunger and fear, navigated a world often indifferent or hostile, and yet here he was, transformed from solitary survivor into vigilant guardian. And now it was my turn to act, to make a choice that could protect this bond from forces beyond our control. I remembered the words of the shelter worker who had spoken to me earlier, the subtle warnings, the unspoken rules, stray dogs, Even the most loyal or protective were often seen as liabilities, disruptions, or dangers. Authorities could intervene, neighbors could misinterpret intentions, and a fragile trust could crumble in a single moment. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. To honor the German Shepherd, to honor the bond he had nurtured, required bravery of a different kind, measured, deliberate, and unflinching. The baby stirred, a small sigh escaping her lips, tiny fingers brushing the soft blanket. The dog's head lifted instantly, ears forward, nostrils flaring as he assessed the subtle cues of her movement. It was a reminder, silent but potent, of what was at stake. He had chosen this role without hesitation, accepted responsibility without question, and proven the depth of his loyalty and care. And now I had to match that courage, to make a choice not born of convenience but of principle, love, and quiet devotion. I opened the door slowly, careful not to startle either of them. The dog shifted, muscles tensing briefly, then settled again as my presence was recognized as a non-threat. He had learned, through hours of observation and patient engagement, to interpret intention and discern care from danger. And in that instant, I knew that his vigilance had prepared him for more than protecting the baby. It had prepared him for partnership, for mutual trust, for the quiet affirmation that choices made with love could withstand uncertainty. Stepping fully into the nursery, I knelt near the crib, letting my hands rest lightly on the edge, careful not to disturb the baby's slumber. The German Shepherd remained at the window, gaze unwavering, tail sweeping gently across the floor in rhythm with the baby's breathing. I felt the profound magnitude of what had been accomplished. Through patience, observation, and quiet devotion, he had bridged the gap between instinct and empathy, between survival and guardianship, and now it was my turn to bridge the gap between recognition and action. A soft sound echoed from the hall, the creak of a door, the faint shuffle of footsteps in the apartment building. The dog's head lifted sharply, ears forward, nostrils flaring, muscles coiled. Yet instead of aggression, there was a measured readiness, a calm assurance that he would protect without unnecessary escalation. He was prepared to confront uncertainty, to act with purpose, guided by the intelligence born of hardship and the loyalty forged through the quiet vigil of the past hours. I realized that this was the moment to act, to claim responsibility, not just for observation, but for advocacy. I would speak for him, defend the bond he had nurtured, and ensure that neither fear nor misunderstanding could sever the fragile connection between the baby and her silent guardian. The decision was not easy. The consequences of intervention could be unpredictable, and yet I understood that inaction was no longer an option. The weight of their trust rested on me, and I would not falter. I reached for the leash, worn but intact, a subtle symbol of commitment and readiness. The dog's eyes followed every motion, head tilting slightly as he interpreted my intent. There was no doubt in his gaze, no questioning of purpose, only recognition, understanding, and quiet confidence. I attached the leash carefully, feeling the weight of what this gesture represented. Acknowledgement of his role, acceptance of shared responsibility, and the declaration that this bond would not be broken by circumstance, fear, or human error. Stepping outside, the rain had intensified, each droplet falling like a soft percussion against the pavement. The German Shepherd walked beside me, posture alert yet composed, every sense engaged in the silent dialogue of protection and presence. The baby was cradled safely in my arms, her small body warm against mine, breathing steady and calm. And in that moment, I felt the culmination of the past hours. The trials, the quiet transformations, the tests of loyalty and vigilance manifested in a single, decisive act. We moved down the street slowly, intentionally, giving the dog space to survey, anticipate, and respond. Each step carried the weight of consequence, yet also the promise of redemption. He had endured the harshness of the world alone, and now through our shared action, he was being affirmed, recognized, and given the opportunity to continue his guardianship in a world that might otherwise have misunderstood him. Every subtle glance, every careful adjustment of his body, every measured sniff and observation was a reaffirmation of trust, courage, and the quiet power of devotion. The apartment door behind us closed softly, the interior settling into stillness, leaving us to navigate the night together. Rain-soaked streets, glowing lamplight, and distant echoes created a cinematic stage upon which our silent affirmation of loyalty and care played out. I felt the weight of history in his movements, the echoes of countless nights spent alone, the faint scars that mapped a life of survival, and yet all of that had culminated in this transformative act. He had become more than a dog, more than a survivor. He had become a sentinel, a guardian, and a partner in the delicate dance of protection and trust. And as the night deepened, as the rain fell steadily and the baby's gentle breaths harmonized with the soft rhythm of his vigilance, I understood that redemption, loyalty, and courage were not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet, deliberate, and measured. Sometimes they manifested in a dog's unwavering gaze, a subtle shift of weight, or the decision of a human to act on instinct guided by love. In that quiet intersection of choice, observation, and presence, a bond was affirmed that would endure, silently, profoundly, and eternally. The first quiet hours of night had settled into a serene hush, broken only by the soft patter of lingering rain on the pavement and the occasional distant hum of a passing car. Inside the nursery, the baby lay curled beneath a worn, soft blanket, her small body rising and falling with steady, even breaths. The German shepherd rested just beyond the crib, body partially stretched along the floor, head tilted slightly, eyes never leaving her form. His presence had transformed from vigilant to wholly reassuring a living sentinel, whose patience and loyalty had quietly reshaped the room itself. I remained in the doorway, hands clasped loosely, unwilling to intrude but unable to leave. Hours of observation, decision-making, and quiet action had led to this delicate moment, the culmination of a bond forged through shared vigilance, subtle gestures, and the slow accumulation of trust. The rain had softened, leaving faint streaks along the window pane, each one glimmering in the dim light like tiny marks left by time itself. And within that softly illuminated space, the baby and her guardian existed in a fragile, almost sacred equilibrium. The dog shifted slightly, tail brushing against the floor, a gentle sound that blended with the rhythm of the baby's breathing. He had endured so much: the cold streets, hunger, solitude, and yet here he was, fully present, fully committed, fully aware of the fragile life he had chosen to protect. Every muscle in his body relaxed, yet every sense remained alert, tuned to the subtleties of movement, sound, and breath. It was a balance perfected over hours of quiet observation and moments of trial, a testament to the depth of his endurance and the intelligence born of survival. I moved a step closer, careful to respect the invisible boundaries that had formed between them. The dog's eyes flicked toward me, reading my motion, gauging intent. There was no question in that look, no hesitation, only recognition and understanding. I realized then that the trust between us had grown as well, that the bond I had observed and nurtured in silence was not limited to the pair in the crib, but now extended to me as an accomplice, a guardian of the fragile equilibrium that had been established. The baby stirred, a tiny sigh escaping her lips, and the German shepherd responded with a subtle shift, lowering his head slightly as if to offer reassurance. His nose brushed against the soft blanket, careful not to disturb her sleep, and in that gesture I saw the culmination of his transformation, from solitary survivor to vigilant protector to gentle companion. The room seemed to hold its breath in that moment, suspended between movement and stillness, awareness and trust. I thought back to the nights he must have endured, alone in the cold, navigating dangers both seen and unseen. Every scar on his body, every limp in his gait told the story of endurance and hardship. And yet, none of that had diminished his capacity for care, empathy, and protective love. In fact, it had honed it, refined it, and prepared him for this role, a role that demanded patience, intelligence, and unwavering commitment. Now, in the quiet glow of the nursery, I understood that he had fulfilled it beyond measure. The baby's small fingers curled around the edge of her blanket, her body relaxing further under the soft, protective presence of her guardian. The dog shifted once more, settling his head gently near her, tail curling around the edge of the crib as if to form a boundary, a shield against the uncertainties of the world beyond these walls. His eyes remained open, vigilant yet calm, a silent promise that her safety was not contingent on luck, circumstance, or chance, but on a deliberate, conscious choice born of loyalty, experience, and quiet courage. I felt a deep exhalation escape me, a release of tension accumulated over the past hours, as I realized the profound significance of what had been created. This bond was not transient, nor was it fragile in the way one might fear. It was resilient, tempered by trials and strengthened through patient, careful observation. It existed in every subtle gesture, every gentle adjustment, every soft, measured breath. And I understood, with a clarity that settled over me like the quiet of night, that it would endure beyond this evening, beyond these walls, beyond the immediate threats that had tested it. The rain had slowed to a whisper, leaving the faintest mist that clung to the street and the edges of the window. The dog rose slowly, stretching with deliberate movements that spoke of comfort and confidence. He moved along the edge of the crib, nose dipping slightly to ensure the baby's position remained secure, eyes sweeping the room with practiced vigilance. Each action was deliberate, slow and careful, embodying a rhythm that had been established through hours of trust, attention, and quiet endurance. I knelt beside the crib, careful not to disturb the delicate balance. My hand hovered briefly above the blanket, hesitant to intrude, and then rested lightly on the edge. The dog's eyes flicked to mine, assessing, acknowledging, accepting. It was a quiet affirmation that the bond we had nurtured together was not fragile, not contingent on perfection, but grounded in awareness, patience, and shared responsibility. The baby stirred slightly, small lips parting in a soft sigh, and the German Shepherd responded with a gentle nudge of his nose against the blanket. The contact was so light, it could have been mistaken for happenstance, yet it carried the weight of deliberate protection, assurance, and care. It was a language without words, a dialogue of presence and trust, and I realized then that it had become the defining rhythm of our shared existence. The night deepened, shadows folding softly into corners, the nursery illuminated only by the faint glow of a lamp and the reflective light of the street beyond. The dog settled beside the crib, head resting gently, tail curled neatly at his side, and for the first time I felt the full weight of peace descend upon the room. Not the absence of threat, but the presence of trust, vigilance, and mutual recognition, the quiet culmination of patience, loyalty, and the delicate artistry of endurance. I remained still, observing, breathing with the same rhythm as the room itself, as if to honor the fragile equilibrium that had been created. Each minute stretched, carrying with it the significance of survival, guardianship, and love, expressed not in words but in presence. The dog's eyes closed briefly, a subtle relaxation that spoke of trust and confidence, while the baby remained peacefully asleep, small body rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. In that quiet sanctuary, I understood the profound truth of the past hours, that bonds formed in patience, nurtured through vigilance, and solidified in trust, could withstand uncertainty, fear, and hardship. The German Shepherd had claimed his role as guardian, and in doing so had quietly transformed our lives, teaching lessons of loyalty, endurance, and the gentle power of care. And now in the softness of night, with the baby secure and the dog at her side, the story found its emotional closure, a whispered affirmation that love, presence, and quiet courage could endure beyond circumstance, beyond hardship and beyond fear. The first light of dawn crept softly through the thin curtains, casting a pale, gentle glow across the nursery. The rain had ceased, leaving only faint traces along the window pane, streaked with the memory of a night that had been both tender and harrowing. Outside, the city remained quiet, muffled by the soft mist that clung to streets and rooftops. Inside, the room held a profound stillness, broken only by the gentle rise and fall of the baby's chest and the measured, patient breaths of her German Shepherd guardian. I remained at the doorway, reluctant to disturb the fragile serenity, yet compelled to witness this final, delicate chapter unfold. The dog lay at the edge of the crib, head resting lightly near her tiny hands, muscles relaxed but ready, tail curled with a sense of rhythm that mirrored the baby's breathing. There was a quiet completeness to him now, a fulfillment of purpose that radiated in every subtle movement, in every gentle shift of weight, and in the softness of his gaze. He had transformed through patience, observation, vigilance, and loyalty, and now, in this final hour of night, he embodied the quiet culmination of all he had endured. The baby stirred softly, stretching tiny arms beneath the blanket, small fingers brushing her cheeks. The dog's head lifted just enough to follow her subtle movements, eyes steady, expression serene yet alert. There was no urgency, no sudden shift of motion, only the slow, deliberate affirmation that she was safe and that his presence remained an unspoken promise of protection and care. I watched, breath held, as the bond I had observed since the first rain-soaked night revealed its enduring depth and quiet strength. I thought of the journey that had led to this moment, nights of cold and solitude, the scars etched into his body by a world indifferent to survival, the cautious steps he had taken toward trust and empathy, the small gestures of presence that had grown into a profound, almost sacred guardianship. And here, at the threshold of dawn, all of those experiences coalesced into a quiet certainty. He had not merely survived. He had found purpose, connection, and a bond that transcended instinct, circumstance, and the unpredictability of human life. The baby's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the soft light, and immediately found his gaze. There was a moment, a single, suspended heartbeat where recognition passed between them. No words were needed, none would ever suffice. The quiet understanding of trust, loyalty, and protection had been etched into their interaction through hours of subtle communication, through careful observation and patient care. Her small hands reached toward him, brushing the tip of his nose, and he responded with a gentle nudge of his head, a delicate affirmation of presence, connection, and reassurance. I felt a warmth swell in my chest, a quiet relief that this bond, tested by the uncertainties of the night and the world beyond, had endured. It was a living testament to patience, resilience, and the gentle power of unwavering attention. The German Shepherd had met challenges without aggression, had assessed threats without panic, had sustained vigilance without faltering, and had, in the process, created a sanctuary within the nursery walls, a sanctuary of trust, love, and shared understanding. The first rays of sunlight began to touch the street outside, pale gold spilling across the wet pavement. The dog shifted slightly, stretching with deliberate care, his body radiating calm readiness. He had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the baby's movements, the subtle cues of breath and gesture, and now he responded with a quiet perfection born of hours of attentive guardianship. Every motion was an echo of his journey, every adjustment a testament to the lessons learned from hardship, endurance, and survival. I knelt beside the crib, careful not to intrude, and let my hand hover near the edge of the blanket. The dog's eyes flicked toward me, calm, steady, acknowledging without expectation. It was a moment of shared understanding, an affirmation that the bond we had nurtured together between child, guardian, and observer was intact, resilient, and enduring. His loyalty was complete, but it was not blind. It was measured, conscious, and profoundly empathetic. The baby's small fingers curled around his ear, gentle and tentative, and he leaned into the touch, allowing the faintest warmth of contact. There was no sudden movement, no gesture beyond the necessary, only the quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of a trust that had been earned, maintained, and affirmed through presence. In that moment, I realized that the true measure of guardianship was not in dramatic acts, but in patient, consistent vigilance expressed through the subtle language of attention and care. The nursery held a silence that was not empty, but rich with meaning. Every breath, every glance, every gentle nudge carried the weight of history and the promise of the future. The dog had transformed from survivor to sentinel to quiet, gentle companion, and in doing so had reshaped the room, the baby's life, and my own understanding of devotion, patience, and love. It was a closure that was not abrupt, not loud, not final in a dramatic sense, but whispered, soft, and enduring like the quiet edge of dawn that marked a transition rather than a conclusion. I watched the dog's gaze follow the baby's tiny hands as they brushed the blanket again, eyes half closed in a peaceful state, and I felt the lingering impression of everything that had passed. The trials of the previous nights, the moments of tension, the subtle challenges of vigilance, all of it had coalesced into a singular living presence. He was more than a protector. He was a teacher, a guardian, and a companion whose quiet courage had left an indelible mark on our lives. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the air fresh and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pavement. The dog rose slowly, stretching fully, and then settled once more at the foot of the crib, body curved slightly as if to form a living shield. His eyes held the depth of understanding that came from both experience and choice, a consciousness of his role and the importance of his presence. And in that stillness, I realized that the story had reached its ultimate resolution, not through drama or spectacle, but through quiet trust, patient guardianship, and enduring love. I stepped back, letting them exist together in the soft morning light. The baby's breathing remained steady, the faintest sighs rising with the rhythm of sleep. The dog's body relaxed, head resting lightly near the blanket, yet every sense remained alert, ready for even the faintest disturbance. It was a balance of repose and vigilance, trust and readiness, a culmination of everything that had come before, an affirmation of the quiet, profound power of patience, loyalty, and shared understanding. And in that final tender moment, I whispered softly to myself, though no one could hear. We had survived, endured, and learned together. The bond forged in rain, in vigilance, in quiet observation, would carry forward, leaving its imprint on lives shaped by presence, care, and unspoken devotion. Outside the nursery, the city awoke to a new day, indifferent to the small miracle that had occurred, but inside, a German shepherd and a baby rested together in a sanctuary of trust, love, and quiet redemption.